We're ready to get started, and I'm pleased to call this hearing to order. We'll come together today, as you know, to discuss the Environmental Protection Agency's recently finalized Good Neighbor Plan, a topic that is personal to me and the 1 million Delawareans I'm privileged to represent here in the Senate. And I think it's personal to millions of other Americans across our country, and I'll be talking about them in just a minute. Before examining the specifics of EPA's Good Neighbor rule, though, let's first take a minute or two to better understand why addressing cross-state air pollution is so important, especially to those of us who live in downwind states. I believe that most Americans realize that air pollution is bad for our health, bad for our planet, bad for business, and that it creates real economic hardships for communities that end up breathing dirty air. In Delaware, we've made great strides in cleaning up our state's air pollution over many years. We've invested millions of dollars in clean air and energy technologies. Yet, despite all of our efforts, some parts of Delaware still do not meet the EPA's health standards for air quality, and we are not alone. Unfortunately, some people have forgotten in this country that air pollution knows no state boundaries. Pollution from sources in one state does not just stop at the border. The pollution controls, or the lack thereof, in some states really do impact the air quality in others. As it turns out, a number of upwind states have not made the same investments in clean technology as many of us have, or they simply have refused to operate the technology full-time that's already been installed in their states. For too long, many Americans living in downwind states have suffered in part because upwind neighboring states refuse to clean up their ozone pollution. According to EPA, ozone pollution, also known as smog, is one of the most prevalent cross-state air pollutants in the United States. And for those who may not know, ozone pollution chokes and inflames people's airways. Ozone can be particularly dangerous for children, for the elderly, and people with lung diseases like asthma. This pollutant can also travel hundreds, sometimes even thousands of miles. And left unchecked, ozone can cost Americans billions of dollars, it's billions with a B, every year in healthcare costs and missed work days, not to mention the lives lost. The effects of this cross-state pollution on downwind states are staggering. For example, emissions from other states account for 94% of ozone pollution in the first state, my state. That means no matter how hard we might work to protect our communities from dirty, smoggy air, the source of the vast majority of the pollution we face lies outside of our state's control. As my colleagues have heard me say, probably more than they care to remember, when I was privileged to serve as governor of Delaware, I could have shut down every emission source in my state's economy, and we would still have been out of attainment of ozone health standards, air health standards. Just think about that. Just think about that. I could have shut down virtually every source of emission in my state. We'd have still been out of attainment for ozone air health standards. That was due to upwind states' dirty emissions. Downwind states need cooperation from our upwind neighbors, and EPA is, if we're ever to have truly healthy air to breathe. And we're not alone. Delaware, like many states on the East Coast, including our neighbor Maryland, sits at the end of what I like to call America's tailpipe. Most of the air pollution in our states comes from outside sources such as power plants, factories, and vehicles not located in our state. That's why we need a national strategy to address pollutants like ozone. Unfortunately, when writing our clean air laws, Democrats and Republicans alike were especially concerned with the plight of downwind states. Under the Clean Air Act's direction, EPA has an obligation to forge partnerships with states in order to make sure that everyone is doing their fair share, their part, to address cross-state pollution. And that's exactly what EPA did earlier this month when issuing the latest Good Neighbor Plan to help downwind states clean up smog pollution, really to follow the golden rule and ensure that states should treat their neighbors the way they would like to be treated. In addition to being justified morally, EPA's science-based rule has well-defined economic and health benefits. For example, this rule will create up to $13 billion, $13 billion, that's billions with a B, in annual health benefits and healthier air for an estimated 80 million people who live downwind. That means fewer missed days of work and school, fewer emergency room visits, and fewer premature deaths. These reductions are also imminently achievable. In fact, many upwind polluters already have the necessary pollution controls installed, but they've chosen not to run them much of the time. Under EPA's rules, more than 270 power plant units with these controls will have to run them full-time, not like next week or next month, not even this year, but by 2024. To me, that's not an undue burden on upwind states. It's basic fairness. I think it's just basic common sense. My dad always used to say to me, Shelley used to say, just use some common sense. And I think it's what we're asking people to do. My mom always used to say, treat other people where you want to be treated, so that I got a healthy dose of that. They helped me write the speech. They don't know it. They're long departed. But let me close by saying that while it's easy to get wrapped up in numbers and statistics when talking about EPA's regulations, the Good Neighbor Rule is about basic fairness. It's about protecting Americans who are breathing dirty air that they didn't create, dirty air that's coming from our neighbors. As recovering governor, I know firsthand how deadly and costly out-of-state air pollution is for us in Delaware, and we're not alone. So on behalf of all Americans, especially the more than 25 million children and adults in our country living with asthma, 25 million living with asthma, I say thanks to the EPA for the Good Neighbor Rule. And as I turn to Senator Capito, one of the things I love doing as governor, I love economic development, just love trying to make sure that people have a job and the ability to provide for themselves and their families. We were faced with a situation where we ended up with electricity costs, energy costs for our businesses and for families as well, that are higher than they should have been. And those who had the pollution control mechanism, didn't use them, they were able to provide cheaper electricity. And that's just not fair. That's not fair either. With that, let me turn to Senator Capito for anything that she wants to say. And thank you so much for all of your work on this as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here today. And common sense sounds like something we definitely agree on, even though I didn't know your dad. I can agree on that. So we look forward to the testimony today. The EPA's so-called Good Neighbor Rule is the latest version of a regulation that has gone by many names, and I've been on this committee for 8 years. I've seen it in different names. It has previously been called the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, or CASPR, the Ozone Transfer Rule, and the NOx Federal Implementation Plan. But they all refer to the same rule, and this is a topic that we've discussed. While being a good neighbor is great, and we all want to be good neighbors, the name is a bit of a misnomer. It's a $14 billion cost rule targeting states that are energy suppliers in our nation and our industrial heartland. So what does that cost us? It costs us, what does that $14 billion in costs get us? Unfortunately, the rule will not change any non-attainment areas to attainment in the downwind states. Instead, it places a burden on states that will help provide our nation with power, manufactured goods, and building materials as though we're in different economies. As we try to make ourselves competitive against rivals like China, bring back and reinforce our supply chains, and make generational investments in our infrastructure, which we are doing now, having our states that provide electricity and manufactured goods to their neighbors is not just the most sustainable solution. We have to compete as one nation. Requirements for the use of American iron, steel, and other materials in the bipartisan infrastructure package are directly undercut by this new iteration of the cross-state air pollution rules that for the first time target those domestic industries and their significantly unionized workforce. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to put a letter from the United Steelworkers expressing great concern about this rule. As we have heard from those sectors, broader concerns about the retirement of baseload energy generation that may reduce the reliability and cost of energy for plants that were built because of those assets. So perhaps this regulation might be more aptly named the headwind rule, because that is what this will be for American workers and consumers. With that table setting out of the way, let's talk about what states with the final headwind rule will impact. It targets 23 states for interstate transport of air pollution. Well, that's down from 26 states in the original proposal. There are still 2 states, Tennessee and Wyoming, in regulatory limbo because the EPA has deferred action on these. The only state that was dropped from this was Delaware. Now, with all due respect to the chairman, that's an interesting omission, isn't it? You and somebody else we know well is from Delaware, right?
Chris Coons.
That's a good one. As I mentioned earlier, this rule is going after power plants and industries, including iron, steel, cement, concrete, pulp and paper, natural gas pipelines for the very first time. So it's a much broader rule impacting more states, which is going to put us in uncharted waters, I believe, as to the implementation. And the process EPA undertook to develop this rule and the way in which the agency went about denying state implementation plans, which I just talked about, cuts against the congressional intent in the Clean Air Act's cooperative federalism approach. For instance, West Virginia's pending State Implementation Plan, or SIP, was denied along with 18 other states in January. But this was a legal step that EPA took before so they could federalize the issue and require a one-size-fits-all, or a FIP, which is a federal implementation plan. With witnesses representing 3 different states, I look forward to hearing from them on how the SIP development process typically works and who knows the intricacies of their states better than the hardworking folks that we have with us today. I'm very glad to see Arizona here because I know they have a unique state. They have a unique case. Being downwind from California, as well as having international transport of pollutants from China and Mexico that affect its attainment on various air regulations, and facing potential incorporation into this rule, I look forward to hearing Ms. Peters' views on what this may mean for her state. It would be a shame if the only hypothetical benefits for Arizona are as a result of shuttering or reducing shifts for manufacturing sites in California, because that seems the most likely outcome. And it will leave Arizona, if it doesn't happen, to be sanctioned under tightened national ambient air quality standards for ozone and particulate matter that the EPA is working on. I'm not even sure the EPA knows what the ramifications of this will be for states or the impacted sectors. My office has heard repeatedly from the industries being regulated for the very first time under this rule, under the Office of Air, that the EPA did not understand the businesses or the technologies that they were attempting to regulate. That does explain the significant changes in covered facilities and components between the original proposal and the final rule, which we're glad about that. But even with those changes, there will be hidden costs for Americans in the form of higher prices, delayed or unbuilt infrastructure, potentially lost jobs, and that could result in litigation. So I truly hope that the EPA knows when they take action that it is likely to shut down our nation's industries. It does not mean the need for those products will disappear. Instead, it merely moves the need for these abroad to countries with lower environmental standards, the opposite of what both parties are trying to accomplish in terms of reshoring our manufacturing base. This rule is just one piece of the administration's plan to target affordable, reliable baseload power generation. As we know from a presentation in February of 2020, the EPA has been developing a number of new regulations drafted to disproportionately affect coal and natural gas power plants. The Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote about how these policies, like the ozone transport rule that we are talking about today, are driving power plant retirements and how those plants are shutting down without adequate replacement capacity for the grid. As the Wall Street Journal observed, quote, the steep cost of complying with the EPA regulations, including a proposed good neighbor rule that is expected to be finalized next month, will force about 10,500 megawatts of fossil fuel generation to shut down. And now this rule that has been finalized, it is actually projected that it will shutter 14,000 megawatts. In comments to the so-called Good Neighbor proposal, MISO, which is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, stated that the proposal creates significant concerns about MISO's ability to maintain electric reliability. PJM, which covers my state and several other states represented, is also ringing the alarm about the effects that retirements will have. and explains that most upcoming power plant retirements are policy-driven. The cooperative federalism model under the Clean Air Act has resulted in significant reduction in air pollution over these 5 decades. More can be achieved in the years to come through coordination between the states and the federal government, and something I expect to hear from our state witnesses today. But imposing a federal plan on half the states does nothing to support that spirit of collaboration and will only, I think, harm our national economy. So thank you for holding this hearing, Chairman Carper, and I look forward to the witnesses.
Thank you so much, Senator Capito. And now we're going to turn to our esteemed panel of witnesses. Not every panel is termed esteemed, so you're in, you guys are in good company, and we're lucky that you're here. Yeah. Yeah, no, you will. You will. Yeah, and Senator Cardin's going to introduce the witness so we haven't forgotten that. Don't just bear with us for a minute. But I'm going to mention the names of the witnesses, and the 3 that don't have senators introducing. I'll say a few words about you. First, Dr. David Hill. Dr. Hill, a practicing pulmonary and critical care physician from Waterbury, Connecticut. Dr. Hill serves as chair of the Public Policy Committee of the American Lung Association and sits on the American Lung Association Board of Directors. Thanks for all of that, and welcome. So the Secretary of Maryland Department of Environment, Serena McElwain, is going to be introduced by a gentleman to my left, my colleague, Barbara Mikulski used to say my Delmarva buddy. But anyway, he's going to introduce you and welcome Ms. McElwain. Third, we're going to hear from the Director of Arizona's Department of Environmental Quality. That's Karen Peters. Karen, nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. Next, we'll hear from the Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality, Chris Wells, who I had to twist his arm to get Roger Wicker to introduce you, but he's finally agreed to do so. That's not true. But last but not least, we'll hear from Paul No. Is that right? Is it No or Noe? Noe. But you do have an E. All right. For the record, Paul Noe, Vice President of Public Policy for the American Forest and Paper Association. We thank you all for appearing before our committee today. Thank you for the preparation for this hearing. And I'm going to turn it over now to our colleague, Senator Cardin, who's going to introduce you, Ms. McElwain. Ben.
Well, first of all, thank you, Chairman Carper, for convening this hearing. I want to welcome Secretary Serena McElwain, our new Secretary of Health in Maryland. She was recently appointed by the Governor Moore, our new governor in the state. I do want to just observe, when you acknowledge this as an esteemed panel, the last hearing we had, the last panel we had was made up of members of the Senate, and you didn't say that that was an esteemed panel.
But I did say they had real potential.
It is very appropriate that we have Secretary McElwain here because Maryland has a very strong commitment to the environment, and we recognize that our responsibilities go beyond our borders. So we're very pleased to have our principal person for the environment as one of our witnesses today. And we do believe in good neighbors. We think we're good neighbors with Delaware and West Virginia. We work together, Chesapeake Bay issues. We even are good neighbors with Mississippi, with the Appalachian Regional Commission. So we do work together. So let me just give you a very quick, impressive background about Secretary McElwain. She was the Undersecretary of the California EPA. She was the Assistant Regional Administrator for EPA Region 9 in San Francisco, California. She holds 2 master's degrees, one a master's in public administration from George Mason University and a master's in administration and international studies from Central Michigan University. She is a key player in Maryland's contribution to clean air and water, and I think it's very appropriate that she be one of our witnesses today. Welcome, Secretary McElwain.
Yeah. Did you grow up in Michigan? Okay.
Virginia.
Virginia. All right. Where? Where? Okay, all right. My sister and I grew up in Danville and Roanoke. Danville and Roanoke. All right, now I think Senator Wicker is going to introduce one of our witnesses from his state. Senator
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate the opportunity to introduce Chris Wells, Director of the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality. And we're honored to have him here. He's a native of Brandon, Mississippi, and was appointed by our current governor, Governor Reeves, to be Executive Director of the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality, or MDEQ, in October of 2020. As the leader of MDEQ, Executive Director Wells is responsible for protecting the state's environment and administers most of the Environmental Protection Agency's programs within the state. He has extensive experience in the field of environmental compliance and has been with MDEQ since 2007. Throughout his time with the state agency, he's provided legal support for the environmental compliance and has also served as Chief of Staff. In addition, Executive Director Wells serves as Mississippi's trustee for the Natural Resources Damage Assessment under the Oil Pollution Act. He represents the state on the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Council, and he received his degree in chemical engineering from Mississippi State University and his Juris Doctor from Mississippi College School of Law in 1999. He has important perspectives to provide to the committee today, and I might add as an aside, I was so glad to hear our distinguished chairman speak of upwind states having an effect on the downwind states, and I would join the distinguished ranking member in saying I'm glad we're going to talk about common sense, because Director Wells has the very difficult task of somehow understanding an EPA determination that ozone emissions coming from Mississippi somehow affect an upwind state of Texas, Dallas, Texas, and Houston, Texas, cities who in and of themselves have way more population than our entire state of less than 3 million. It is as if Delaware were being blamed for ozone pollution in Cincinnati, Mr. Chairman, which I think any of us who have watched weather patterns over the years and watched the way the map works, we certainly realize that Cincinnati is upwind of Delaware, and Houston and Dallas, Texas are upwind of Mississippi, and it is hard for us to grasp that somehow our relatively rural state is causing ozone problems for Dallas and Houston. So that is the conundrum that this distinguished witness will be discussing today, and I'm delighted that the committee has agreed to hear from him. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Wicker. My hope is that we'll be guided by science here, and at the end of the day, we'll be better prepared to deal with these issues in a fair and thoughtful way. And I think with that, we'll begin our witness testimony. Dr. Hill, please proceed with your statement if you're ready, please. And again, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Senator Carper and Ranking Member Capito and the committee for having me here to testify today.
Just for the record, we pronounce her name Capito.
Capito. My apologies.
Capito.
Don't worry about it.
Hill is easy. Everyone gets it right.
It happens all the time.
My name is pronounced Coons.
My name is Dr. David Hill. I'm a practicing pulmonary and critical care physician in Waterbury, Connecticut. As mentioned, I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the American Lung Association, and I chair its Public Policy Committee. In my clinical practice, I see adults and children as young as 6 years of age with severe lung disease. And in addition to testifying at this hearing today, I'm joining more than 100 turquoise-clad lung cancer advocates, some of whom are in this room, who are meeting with their senators and members of Congress on the Hill today. Each April, the American Lung Association releases its State of the Air report. In our 2022 report, we found that more than 122 million people lived in the 156 counties that earned an F grade for ozone, including half of Connecticut's counties. My home county of New Haven earned a failing grade for ozone. Our neighbor to the southwest, Fairfield County, has the dirtiest air for ozone pollution in the eastern United States. So why is the air polluted in Connecticut? In Connecticut, we manufacture championship basketball teams. We don't have oil refineries.
Don't rub it in. Your time may be limited here.
Coal-fired power plants, or other large petrochemical plants. We do have a huge burden of emissions from the tailpipes of vehicles on our roads. The biggest challenge for Connecticut is our location. We live at the end of another tailpipe, the one that brings pollution to us from upwind states. And if you reference the EPA's map, all arrows point to Waterbury Hospital, where I practice. Controlling the sources of pollution in Connecticut alone isn't enough to ensure our air is clean. We need the sources in all the upwind states to clean up their emissions. Our most persistent air pollutant is ozone. Ozone is a powerful lung irritant. It causes inflammation and can damage multiple body systems. It can also shorten lives. Short-term exposure causes breathing problems such as chest tightness, coughing, and shortness of breath, and worsens the symptoms for patients with asthma and COPD. Long-term exposure can cause lasting harm to respiratory health. Ozone exposure also increases the risk of metabolic disorders like diabetes, harms the central nervous system, causes reproductive and developmental harm, including preterm birth and stillbirth, causes possible cardiovascular effects, and leads to premature death. We also know that air pollution disproportionately affects people of color and socially disadvantaged communities. We show in our 2022 State of the Air report that people of color were 61% more likely than white people to live in a county with a failing grade for at least one air pollutant. In my home county, 40% of the residents are people of color. Ozone pollution is driving healthcare disparities. Last week, I met with a new patient, a 56-year-old marathon runner with allergic rhinitis and new onset asthma. He had moved to Connecticut from northern Vermont and noted that since moving to our community, he was more short of breath even when exercising on flat ground. He attributed his symptoms to the noticeably worse local air quality. As a former middle school science teacher, he started monitoring air quality himself so he could better manage his symptoms. His air pollution story is a very common story among my patients. People in my state, and my patients in particular, are important beneficiaries of EPA's new Good Neighbor rule. As a lung physician, I am frustrated that not all power plants and large industrial polluters are required to have effective nitrogen oxide controls. I'm surprised that power plants don't always run their existing controls, and it doesn't make sense to have life-saving effective pollution controls installed and simply turn them off. I'm angry that this can occur legally on the hottest days and smoggiest days of the year. Under the old rules, these plants can comply with their permits while not operating their controls. I'm glad that the EPA's Good Neighbor rule is going to require the installation of pollution controls and require the polluting facilities to run their controls. The Good Neighbor rule reduces the health burden of ozone exposure. EPA projects that in 2026, the Good Neighbor rule will prevent 1,300 premature deaths, avoid more than 2,300 hospital and emergency room visits, and cut asthma exacerbations by 1.3 million cases. This rule is good news for my patients, and everyone who lives downwind from the 23 states will become better neighbors. It is actually good news for everyone who breathes, because when you can't breathe, nothing else matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hill, for that. Senator Cardin, anything else you want to say about our next witness?
Well, I was going to rebut Senator Wicker's comments on but I think I'll allow the Secretary to testify.
All right. Secretary McElwain, please proceed.
Good morning, Chair Carper.
Go ahead and turn your microphone on, please. We want to hear every word.
Okay,
Every word.
there we are. Good morning, Chair Carper, Ranking Member Capito, Senator Cardin, and members of the committee. My name is Serena McElwain. I am the Secretary of the Maryland Department of the Environment, other known as MDE. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss this important step by the Environmental Protection Agency to ensure the citizens of every state, every community in America enjoys clean air. Over the past 50 years, the Clean Air Act has benefited millions of Americans, largely through the federal-state partnership embodied in that landmark environmental law. While we have enjoyed great progress, interstate transport of air pollution is still a problem for many states, including Maryland. EPA's new Good Neighbor rule is a significant step in the right direction to address ozone pollution that is carried by wind across state lines. The state of Maryland, through Governor Moore's administration and MDE, strongly supports EPA's rule. We welcome the promise that its requirements placed on Maryland, as well as other states, will ensure that, indeed, we all are good neighbors. Maryland takes its obligations as an upwind state very seriously. Under this rule, Maryland will continue to show leadership in addressing ozone pollution from our state that enters into New York and Connecticut area downwind. At the same time, Maryland will benefit from the pollution reductions in the rule. Research shows that ozone levels in air entering Maryland from upwind states often already approach the health-based standard as it reaches our borders. That means the ozone concentrations in our air will exceed the standard and threaten our citizens' health, no matter how well we are controlling our own pollution sources. The rule requires immediate and long-term pollution reductions from power plants and certain industrial sources. The reductions resulting from the rule will improve air quality, saving lives and improving public health in communities across the nation. Maryland agrees with EPA's analysis that the rule's proven cost-effective measures will deliver clean air and substantial health benefits, which includes prevention of premature deaths, reduced emergency room visits and hospital visits, reduced lost work and school days, and asthma symptoms in millions of Americans. The rule also provides for a broad range of secondary benefits, including improved visibility in national parks and increasing protection for sensitive ecosystems and coastal waterways, including the Chesapeake Bay. The rule requires pollution reductions from all 23 states named in the rule, including Maryland. Maryland is a leader in effective and innovative air pollution control programs that have provided substantial pollution reductions both in our state and across state lines. But the proven programs in place in Maryland are not in place in many other states that are named in this rule. That is not fair. It's not just. So this rule fixes that. It will put the states on equal footing. It requires other states to limit pollution from power plants and some industrial sources in a manner that is equally as stringent as the limits already implemented in Maryland and in other leadership states as well. I don't want to say all of this to brag about the programs in Maryland, although it sounds like I'm bragging, but I'm demonstrating that it does show that the actions required under this EPA rule are already proven to work. They have been shown to be technically feasible and cost-effective, and it's a way to reduce pollution. EPA's limits will increase equity between the states that have already incurred costs to reduce pollution and the states that have more cost-effective reductions left to achieve. In the end, it is critical for all of us to reduce our contributions to the unhealthy air that overburden communities in downwind states are often too forced to endure. To be good neighbors. In closing, Maryland supports EPA's rule as a comprehensive and protective approach to addressing ozone pollution transport. The final rule is reasonable, it's achievable, it's equitable, and it brings much-needed pollution reductions for downwind states and overburdened communities. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. I've provided more information in the written testimony. I look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
We look forward to it as well. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. When were you sworn in in your post back in Maryland? When?
I'm sorry?
When were you sworn in to your new post?
About 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
I appreciate very much those comments. We appreciate very much those comments. And now we're going to hear from Director Peters from Arizona. Where in Arizona are you from?
Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay, good. We're glad you're here. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee, my name is Karen Peters. I am the new Director of the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, having been appointed by Governor Katie Hobbs. I welcome the opportunity to testify on EPA's newly adopted Good Neighbor Plan for the 2015 Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. The Good Neighbor Rule is a key provision of the Clean Air Act, as it requires each state's State Implementation Plan, or SIP, to ensure that emissions from sources within their state do not contribute significantly to non-attainment or interfere with maintenance of the NAAQS in other states. As I'll explain, the ability of state and local governments to protect public health from the effects of ozone concentrations exceeding the NAAQS is limited. Programs such as the Good Neighbor Plan that provide a mechanism to address pollution originating outside a state's boundaries are therefore a crucial component of the effort to address ozone pollution. One factor that restricts the state ability to address ozone pollution is the limit on state regulatory jurisdiction imposed by the Clean Air Act. As we know, ozone is produced by the chemical reaction of oxides of nitrogen, or NOx, and volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, in the presence of sunlight, which is abundant in my state of Arizona. In the Phoenix Mesa ozone non-attainment area, motor vehicles and non-road engines are responsible for approximately 50% of local emissions of VOC and 90% of the local emissions of NOx. As you know, states other than California are preempted by the Clean Air Act from adopting emission standards for new motor vehicles or new or existing non-road engines. Given these restrictions, Arizona has gone about as far as any state can in regulating emissions from mobile sources. The state was an early adopter of a vehicle inspection and maintenance program to reduce emissions from existing motor vehicles. And in 1998, the state obtained a waiver from federal preemption for its clean-burning gasoline program. We were fortunate to do so before 2005 amendments to the Clean Air Act sharply curtailed EPA's authority to grant waivers and made adoption of such programs all but impossible. Since the implementation of these measures, in order to address ground-level ozone, Arizona and its local government partners have had to focus primarily on local industrial sources. But I think it's fair to say we've reached the point of diminishing returns. The Phoenix Mesa area has a long history with the ozone problem. The area was classified as a moderate non-attainment area for the 1-hour NAAQS after enactment of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. The NAAQS, of course, have been amended 3 times since then, in 1997, 2008, and 2015. Because an old non-attainment designation is not revoked until it's attained, the area at one point found itself classified as serious non-attainment for the 1-hour NAAQS, and at the same time in moderate non-attainment for the 1997 8-hour standard. The area later attained both those NAAQS, but is currently a moderate non-attainment area for both the 2008 and 2015 ozone NAAQS. Every non-attainment designation and reclassification requires submission of a new non-attainment plan, and with the exception of a marginal plan, every non-attainment plan must provide for emission reductions leading to attainment and for annual emission reductions until attainment is reached. Arizona has been through so many iterations of this process that there are very few, if any, remaining emission reductions available from the Phoenix Mesa industrial sector. Without continued action by EPA to achieve additional reductions for vehicles and non-road engines, there's little chance that Phoenix Mesa will attain healthy air. I am pleased that Senator Capito recognized the unique position that Arizona is in. Another factor that restricts the ability of a state to attain the NAAQS on its own is that ozone pollution travels. Recognition of this fact lies at the heart of the good neighbor provision. In the Phoenix non-attainment, for example, only 40% of ozone concentrations are attributable to in-state anthropogenic sources of VOC and NOx. About 6% is attributable to anthropogenic sources in neighboring states, and about 2% to sources in Mexico. The remainder is attributable to natural background and other international and interstate sources. These circumstances will make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to achieve the ozone NAAQS in the Phoenix Mesa area without programs such as the Good Neighbor Plan. But the situation is even more dire in Yuma, Arizona, a city in southwestern Arizona near the California border with a population of less than 100,000 people. Yuma was designated as a non-attainment area for the 2015 ozone NAAQS in 2018 and classified as marginal. Statewide emissions account for only 10% of ozone concentrations in Yuma. Local emissions of NOx and VOCs are negligible. So there is virtually nothing that can be done in terms of local emissions reductions to reduce ozone pollution in the Yuma non-attainment area. Yet, the enhanced controls that come with non-attainment status apply, imposing costs on businesses and likely limiting opportunities for economic growth. If the ozone standard were to be revised downward, other areas of Arizona, including rural areas, would likely find themselves in Yuma's predicament. The average monitored values used to determine compliance with the NAAQS for the Arizona monitors is only 3 to 8 parts per billion below the current 70 parts per billion NAAQS. The margin for compliance throughout our state is very slim. Fortunately, Yuma monitors showed attainment with the 2015 standard by the marginal area deadline of 2021, but the modeling included in the Good Neighbor Plan shows that the upwind regional reductions included in the plan are the key to keeping the area from falling back into non-attainment in the future. I appreciate the opportunity to share that experience with you and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much for joining us, and good luck to you in your post now. We're now going to hear from Director Wells. Director Wells, delighted to meet you, and we invite you to please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito, for the invitation to be here today. Senator Wicker, thank you for the kind introduction earlier, and thank you for your leadership and representation of our great state. I'm here today with a heavy heart for my fellow Mississippians who were impacted by the devastating tornadoes over the weekend. My prayers are with them.
Let me just interrupt and say our prayers are with you and Roger, with your constituents. Can't imagine how hard that is.
Thank you. I referred the committee members to the written testimony that I submitted prior to today's hearing for detailed comments. I wanted to take what little time I have today to kind of focus on some key points. You know, Mississippians have a proud heritage of enjoying the outdoors and our beautiful natural resources. We enjoy clean air. We enjoy clean water. The Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality, my agency, we work hard every day to protect those natural resources. We also recognize that with air in particular, air does not respect lines drawn on a map. Accordingly, we take our good neighbor obligations under the Clean Air Act seriously. However, The way EPA has handled this matter not only turned the Clean Air Act on its head, but also resulted in the imposition of emissions reductions that are unnecessarily stringent and disproportionate to Mississippi's alleged downwind impacts to air quality. It's important to keep in mind how the Clean Air Act was structured by Congress and how it's supposed to work. EPA, in the first instance, has the responsibility to set national ambient air quality standards, and in the context of the Good Neighbor provision, to determine if a state is impacting air quality in another state. It is the states that are then given the prerogative and the right to establish through its state implementation plan how it will meet those standards and how it will address those downwind impacts, if any. And we did just that in this case. We followed EPA's own guidance and information available to us at the time, and we submitted what we believed then, and we still believe now, was an approvable SIP in 2019. Instead of approving the SIP, EPA sat on it for 2.5 years. Then they denied it based on information and modeling and purported downwind impacts that were not available to us when we developed our SIP. Instead of giving us a reasonable opportunity to evaluate and critique the modeling and to modify our SIP if necessary to try to address our alleged downwind impacts, and citing self-imposed deadlines established through what I can only assume was some sort of sue and settle arrangement with environmental groups, EPA denied the SIP and imposed this FIP. That is not the process that Congress laid out in the Clean Air Act. As to the modeling in particular, as Senator Wicker alluded to earlier, and I'll put a little finer point on it, I'm not a meteorologist. I don't pretend to be one. I have watched the ones that are on TV. And I know that whatever happens in Dallas, weather-wise, hits us about a day or two later, meaning that our weather comes from Texas, not the other way around. But you know, that's really kind of the problem. The modeling effort, the modeling process is very complex, and it involves a lot of uncertainty. And EPA has acknowledged that uncertainty in the final rule. We simply are not convinced that we have any actual impacts to Texas air quality. And the process that EPA followed here did not afford us the opportunity that we should have been given to really evaluate that modeling. But let's set that aside, and let's say for argument's sake that the modeling is accurate, which is a leap of faith given the fact that EPA continued to tweak the modeling even after the denial of the SIP, and they got varying results right up until the time that they issued the FIP. The process that EPA should have followed, as dictated by the Clean Air Act, would have allowed Mississippi to determine what emissions reductions and by which facilities would meet our obligations as good neighbors. Instead, EPA imposed requirements that we believe are more stringent than what would be required to address our purported downwind impacts. One thing I want to be clear about is I'm not here trying to avoid Mississippi's good neighbor obligations. We want healthy air for all. If we're impacting another state's air quality, we'll do what's required. However, we should have, in this case, number one, been given a reasonable opportunity to critique the modeling and to ensure some level of certainty regarding our purported downwind impacts. And/or we should have been given the opportunity to modify our state implementation plan before having EPA's judgment substituted for our own. Again, thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion.
Director Wells, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks very much for your testimony. Now we're going to hear from Mr. Noe. And Mr. Noe, please proceed. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you so much for hearing our concerns about EPA's Good Neighbor Plan. AF&PA represents manufacturers of paper products made in the United States. Our forest products industry employs about 925,000 hardworking people, producing 5% of our nation's GDP. Paper products support sustainable living. Paper mills support the American workforce, and they produce carbon-neutral bioenergy and support our recycling. And the paper industry works hard every day to be a good neighbor in communities large and small. Our goal is sustainable regulation that satisfies legal requirements, supports environmental and economic progress. Congress enacted the Clean Air Act to enhance air quality with dual purposes: to promote public health and welfare and the productive capacity of our nation. Unfortunately, we don't think that the Good Neighbor Plan, and especially our inclusion in it, meets that goal. AF&PA has a long track record of working with EPA. We recognize that all Americans benefit when EPA crafts sustainable rules. For example, during the Obama administration, EPA proposed an unachievable Boiler Act rule, but EPA engaged stakeholders, and EPA listened. We defended EPA's final rule in court. Our industry could go on and compete in our highly competitive global marketplace. By stark contrast, the Good Neighbor Plan rulemaking process felt rushed and broke down. First, EPA erred in concluding that paper boilers as a group met EPA's emissions threshold by significantly impacting 10 non-attainment areas. Second, EPA incorrectly concluded that our industry could reduce NOx emissions below its $7,500 per ton threshold, claiming that our cost was $3,800 per ton. The real cost is 10 times higher. In the final rule, EPA bypassed these errors by moving the goalposts. They lumped our industry together with all the others, and they claim as a whole, the non-utility industries can install cost-effective controls and meet the limits. But EPA made unrealistic technology assumptions. EPA implies that selective catalytic reduction is a proven technology for boilers, for our boilers, and it is not. And trying to make SCR work would actually increase our greenhouse gas emissions by 166,000 tons annually. That's over the emissions of 35,000 gasoline-powered cars. And the paper industry can continue to be a leader in sustainable manufacturing. Our mills have reduced our NOx emissions by 50% since 2000. And our goal is to cut our greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030, which aligns with President Biden's goals. EPA offers a vague promise of a case-by-case alternative if a facility can prove technical impossibility or extreme economic hardship. This converts a congressionally granted authority to consider cost and promote the productive capacity of our nation into an impossibility standard. It's vague and it's unfair. After compliance costs of almost $14 billion, the final rule will not result in a single non-attainment area coming into compliance. The Good Neighbor Plan is not a sustainable regulation, and this is only the tip of the iceberg. An enormous cumulative regulatory challenge now faces the U.S. manufacturing sector. Many rulemakings disregard costs and unintended outcomes and stray beyond the bounds of the law. I am deeply concerned that an undisciplined regulatory deluge threatens high-paying union jobs, especially in rural America. This comes just as our country is trying to encourage onshoring of essential manufacturing industries, including our own. We must change this trajectory. It threatens United States manufacturing, including our forest products industry. Ultimately, it threatens the American worker. Men and women in high-paying, high-skilled manufacturing jobs, both rural and urban, red and blue states. These are proud, hardworking people who only ask for the right to compete. Our goal should be sustainable regulation. This requires bipartisan work. We must keep and create sustainable manufacturing jobs in America. There's no better place for a robust manufacturing sector. Thank you for the opportunity to be heard. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks for those comments. This is a committee that's pretty good at finding the middle. As per this committee, it's pretty good at bipartisan solutions. We believe that bipartisan solutions are lasting solutions. And we're a committee that likes working together. We're still going to work on this. We're going to work with the states. We're going to work with the EPA till we get to the right place. I'm going to telegraph my pitch. Baseball season is about to get underway. Ben and I are huge fans. He's an Orioles fan. I'm a Tigers fan. The others in the room will probably have their own teams. But in baseball, they have a saying about a pitcher who, by the way they deliver the pitch, hold the baseball, whatever, they telegraph their pitch. So the hitters know what's coming. So I'm going to telegraph my pitch. The last question I'm going to ask at the end of this hearing of all of you will be, where do you think the consensus lies? Whatever state you happen to be from, where do you think the consensus lies? So just know that that's coming. That'll give you something to look forward to. But before I recognize Senator Capito for her questions, let me ask a couple of questions. I want to start off with Secretary McElwain and Dr. Hill. A question deals with economic costs for downwind states. When, as you know, when EPA issued the Good Neighbor rule earlier this month, we heard some complaints about the economic burdens these new emission reductions would have on upwind states. Yeah, we know that downwind states have long paid the health and economic costs of upwind pollutions. Briefly explain, if you will, Secretary McElwain, Dr. Hill, briefly explain to us the health and economic burdens on downwind states when there is a lack of cooperation and investment by upwind states. And in your answer, please explain how the Good Neighbor rule helps to alleviate some of those burdens on downwind states. Secretary, and then Dr. Hill. Madam Secretary.
Thank you. So when we're not being good neighbors and downwind states, they are exposed to ozone pollution. And so it does causes and creates serious health concerns. You have parents who are not allowed to go to work because they have sick children who were playing outside. You have parents calling in to work. And so when you have your family is sick all the time because of pollution, that creates healthcare costs. So with this rule, it's reducing healthcare and those economic burdens because it is requiring that the power plants use the controls. Most of them have them already. Use those controls and turn them on, and as a result, it reduces ozone pollution. EPA's analysis, it proves that the benefits of pollution reduction outweighs the cost. I'll turn it over to you.
I spoke during my testimony in detail about the health effects of air pollution, and listening to the other testimony here, I believe all the panelists recognize that ozone is a harmful pollutant, particularly in terms of its respiratory effects. As I understand the Good Neighbor rule, it's going to require that power plants and industrial polluters install and operate effective nitrogen oxide controls during ozone season. And this means that air pollution coming to my downwind state is going to be lessened, and it's good news for my patients who suffer from chronic lung disease. 2/3 of the cost of caring for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in this country has to deal with acute exacerbations, patients going to emergency rooms and being hospitalized. Significant burden of the cost of asthma is also for acute deteriorations, and this makes the patient sicker over time. The Good Neighbor rule will reduce the health burdens. EPA has projected that it will prevent premature deaths, that it will avoid hospitalizations, that it will cut asthma exacerbations. School absences will be decreased by over 400,000, and when kids miss school, parents miss work. Over 25,000 lost work days will be avoided. So there will be significant healthcare and economic benefits to instituting the rule.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. Let me ask Ms. Peters, I'm going to ask you for a follow-up, if I could. Same question, but without the Good Neighbor rule and other federal policies to help reduce cross-state smog pollution, would Arizona be forced to make more costly emissions reductions within the state to meet air pollution standards? And if the answer is yes, would you explain why?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The answer is yes. If we don't have controls such as the Good Neighbor Rule, our local emissions sources, our local industrial emission sources are those that would feel the brunt of new controls. And I'll give you an example of that. So in the Phoenix Mesa area, we are in the midst of preparing a SIP because of our redesignation to moderate non-attainment status. And in the discussions about that SIP, one of the things that's being discussed is implementing exactly the controls that are called for here in the Good Neighbor Rule, but on much smaller sources, boilers and smaller EGUs than this rule would control. So you can see that the squeeze on local industrial sources from upwind emissions is causing our areas very much more than they ordinarily would. And I would also point back to Yuma, where the local emissions are so negligible that there's really none to reduce. And so what will be required there is likely to be very costly and difficult.
All right, thank you. Most people know what a SIP is. Tell us what an EGU is. Not everybody has heard that.
My bad. I'm sorry. That's an electric generating unit, power plants.
Well, if we learned nothing else today,
There you go.
we've learned that.
I just learned it recently, so
All
there you
right.
are.
Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you. Director Wells, the Clean Air Act is built on the principle of cooperative federalism, where you work together. We have 3 state regulators here who know their states very well, know the different regions, and know the different impacts of all kinds of environmental impacts and other impacts. Normally, when you're developing a state implementation plan, do you get, in your written testimony, you say basically that the EPA air quality, the head of the EPA's Air Quality Policy Division basically said, I don't care what you write, you're not going to get there. Was that the message that was received by Mississippi? And is that the norm when you're developing your own state implementation plan to be able to meet these the Good Neighbor Rule challenges?
Well, I think that was included that in my testimony,
Right.
because I think it was a candid admission on the part of EPA that they were hell-bent on imposing this rule without the typical cooperative federalism approach that's taken. As I alluded to, we put together what we thought was an approvable SIP based on information that we had at the time, and then EPA changed the rules on us after the game was started, and that was the problem. And so typically, yes, we would have an opportunity to reach a consensus, if you will, on what the modeling should say, or what the impacts might be or really are, and then let's address it once we have a common understanding, if you will.
Yeah, Ms. Peters, was your state implementation plan rejected as well?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Capito. We are awaiting a final determination from EPA.
And how long have you had that in?
I would have to get back to you on that. I'm not exactly sure.
I know there is a time window that it's supposed to be met. Mr. Noe, we talk about social cost of carbon. We talk about pollutants, and sometimes it's difficult, I think, to understand how some of these calculations are being made. And so I guess I would say, as the representative for sort of industrial resources, you have 90,000 people that work in your industry. Is that what you said?
925,000.
I dropped a 0 there. Sorry about that. That's a big difference.
Yes, let's not do that.
Let's not do that. Oops. I heard the 9. Anyway, how do you envision, I mean, most of, at least the paper mills and everything in my state, they're smaller companies. Many of them family owned. They've been in business for a long time, or at least the ones that are, they're not the large paper mills. They're doing, getting the lumber ready for the paper mills, I guess, preparations. How are people going to be able to, number one, interpret this, but also to meet those challenges? I mean, to put the anti-pollutant devices in and around your factory is, what's the calculations of the cost? $14 billion for the whole rule, but for a paper mill, for instance.
Well, thank you for the question, Senator Capito. I guess I would say you raise a lot of very important points, which is, our industry to be successful has to compete in a highly competitive global marketplace. So, and we don't dispute at all the issue that we are and will continue to be a heavily regulated industry. And we've cut our NOx emissions by 50% under 9 other EPA rules and programs.
And I assume you would continue doing that.
And we will
this time.
continue to make progress.
Right.
And that's our goal. But it's so critical to the point the chairman raised, both of you, that we've got to have balance, we've got to have common sense here. And in the case of this rule, there are a number of problems with its application to our industry. There were a number of EPA errors about our industry, which we tried to correct and frankly were ignored. But let me tell you just one fundamental one. I think we could all agree that industry should meet proven technologies. That's what EPA said was happening here. But in our case, the technology, selective catalytic reduction, it just isn't proven for our industry. They made a mistake in that regard. And that's a fundamental mistake. So that's what we're here for, is common sense. So I embrace both what the chairman and you said about that, Senator. And I thank you for the opportunity to be heard on that.
Thank you.
Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank all of our witnesses. Mr. Wells, I agree with you. Process is important, and I appreciate your testimony. There's a challenge whenever we go from one administration to another in doing the adjustments, we try to, I know the administration tries to get it right, but I think your points are very powerful and something that we will certainly be following up on. The federal government, as you acknowledge, has the responsibility under the Clean Air Act to make sure that we achieve what science tells us we can achieve in a cost-effective manner. That's the federal government's responsibility under the Clean Air Act. And our states are doing their responsible actions. But because of the downwind issues, we are dependent upon what other states are doing in order to reach our attainment areas. So when I look at the state of Maryland, which is included in this rule, I find that in the Baltimore area, just about every one of our counties are non-attainment areas because of downwind issues. In the Washington area, every one of our counties are non-attainment because of downwind problems. By the way, Mr. Chairman, the Wilmington area, Cecil County is a non-attainment area because of downwind issues. So these are areas that we cannot control in Maryland in order to reach the attainment. And when you listen to Dr. Hill's testimony and you look at the science, non-attainment has major consequences. So science tells us we can get there, and I think that Secretary McElwain's testimony about proven technologies have been demonstrated in states that can achieve these reductions in a cost-effective manner, that we need to find, as Chairman Carper says, the sweet spot as to how we can move forward on the good neighbor issues. So I hope that we can find that during this process, and I think this hearing has been very helpful. I want to add one more dimension to this before I get to the cost issues. We've been talking about the cost of dirty air from the point of view of our health care system. Representing the state of Maryland, I'm going to bring up the Chesapeake Bay. That's not going to be a surprise to anybody on this committee. I bring it up at just about every hearing. I've been at many meetings on trying to reach our goals on the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and I'm told that one of the major areas that we have not been able to deal with is air pollutants coming into the bay. So it is, and that has very costly consequences, which I don't believe has been calculated in the cost-benefit analysis. I think it's been more dealing with direct health issues related to pollutants, but so it goes beyond just the public health issues that have been brought up today. So, Mr. Chairman, as I understand it, the cost-benefit analysis shows there's like a $13 billion annual plus by the good neighbor rules? I mean, this seems like science is telling us we can achieve this, and there's a huge cost benefit. Mr. Noe, I appreciate your concerns, and if the technology is wrong, we should correct that technology. I agree with you completely on that. But we've got to find that sweet spot because the risk factors to our population and the cost factors to our population indicate that the federal government today is not carrying out its responsibility to make sure that we implement these issues. So I want to give my secretary an opportunity to talk a little bit about the other impacts that this have. I think Dr. Hill's done a really effective job in regards to the public health, but talk a little bit about the other environmental risks that we have as a result of being non-attainment areas in Maryland.
Well, you mentioned the Chesapeake Bay, so I'll talk about that just quickly. Air quality and water quality, they go hand in hand. So when we're trying to control nitrogen oxide pollution in the air, we're controlling the water as well. So I just wanted to make sure I made that connection. And just to continue on Chesapeake Bay, 1/3 of the nitrogen pollution that's in the Chesapeake Bay, it comes from atmospheric disposition from the air that drops into the water. And so this rule helps us to help us with our goals in Maryland to restore the Chesapeake Bay. But the health benefits, you named them very well. Again, you have families who are impacted by this pollution that's coming from upwind states, and this rule will help us to control that and reduce cost and reduce health.
Let me just underscore for everyone's benefit, the nitrogen levels in the bay are critically important to achieving our goals. We have dead zones, we have so many areas that are impacted, the shoreline, the vegetation issues, all that's impacted by the amount of pollutants that come into the bay. 1/3 is coming from airborne. So I just want people to recognize that. We talk about the Chesapeake Bay and protections, and we talk about farmers, and we talk about how we handle our wastewater and how we handle development and all those issues. We also need to be talking about clean air. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. We've been joined by one of our colleagues from Wyoming, Senator Lummis. Delighted to see you. Please proceed. Your record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses, for being here and discussing this consequential interstate transport rule. According to the regulatory impact analysis, the final rule is anticipated to close more than 14,000 megawatts generated by coal-fired power plants. Now, let me state this clearly. The premature forced closure of coal-fired power plants in this nation is a danger to American energy security and grid reliability. This rule and other regulatory actions taken by the EPA cripple our ability to provide affordable, reliable, baseload energy to power our nation. For this reason alone, not to mention the 90,000 direct coal mining jobs in 26 states, including Arizona, Oregon, and Pennsylvania, just to name a few, this administration must reverse course. Now to my questions. Director Wells, in the proposed rule and in the final EPA rule, EPA included a provision called dynamic budgeting. This provision would have EPA adjusting each state's emission budget in the future years to ratchet down the amount of emissions that power generators could use to comply with the rule, eventually driving more and more sources to tighter and tighter emission limits or towards closure. EPA received comments that the dynamic budgeting made the proposed rule overly stringent, more so than what was needed to ensure downwind state compliance with the national ambient air quality standards, and that dynamic budgeting was effectively generation shifting. The Supreme Court, in the case of West Virginia v. EPA, invalidated the Clean Power Plan because of its reliance on generation shifting, So how is generation shifting now okay in this cross-state air pollution rule? And how is the continued forcing of more and more stringent emission limits not over control?
Well, Senator, thank you for the question. I think you're exactly right. The problem is in the uncertainty, not only in terms of the controls and the emission reductions that that a particular facility might have to deal with, but also the uncertainty in just how the initial emission reductions were set by the rule. And I think that's one of the main problems that we have with the rule, is that we've not had an opportunity to really evaluate whether or not a state like Mississippi is actually having an impact, and whether the facilities in our state are actually having an impact on air quality elsewhere, and to force the early retirement of equipment and facilities before the retirements of those facilities is planned for a reason. It's so that the grid can be, and we don't regulate, I'm getting a little bit out of my lane, which EPA is not afraid to do, but I'm not a energy regulator, right? But I know that the people that will have to bear the costs of the early retirement of those facilities are the folks that are some of the same folks that others are concerned about in terms of their health. We're concerned about everybody's health. And so the costs that we talk a lot about, there's a lot of costs that are involved here that have to be considered, not just the purported health costs of a contribution to air quality that is not even certain that Mississippi is causing.
So if you plan to retire baseload and then retire it earlier before a replacement source of baseload energy is identified to replace it, what happens?
Well, the grid becomes unreliable.
There you
Source
go.
of electricity becomes unreliable.
Thank you. One more question. Mr. Noe, as you shared in your testimony, while the EPA does the work to write the rules, it is the regulated community that does the work to actually reduce the emissions. How has the EPA changed the goalposts throughout this process, impacted the ability of the regulated community to make meaningful improvement to our air and environment?
Thank you for the question, Senator. As we said, our goal is sustainable regulation, and I love what Chairman Carper said. We need common sense to work here, so we need regulations that are achievable. And when we brought the EPA's attention to the fact that, look, in your proposed rule, you had two thresholds. Are you a significant emissions contributor, and do you have cost-effective reductions? And then are there proven technologies to get you there? We said, look, you're mistaken on all of those issues. And yet, the final rule has us in a situation where we'd, in theory, be required to put a technology on our facilities that has never been proven to us. And that's in direct contrast to what EPA said in their fact sheet, which is this rule relies on proven, cost-effective technologies. There are other industries where this technology is proven, so I just want to make that clear, but it is not for us. And so we just want to achieve what Chairman Carper said. Let's have common sense. We want rules that work. And, you know, we have many, many rules we comply with, and we work with EPA all the time on making sure that the rules they produce are achievable and are going to be successful.
Thank you.
That's key. Thank you.
Really, really appreciate it. Thank you all, witnesses. Appreciate your being here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We appreciate you being here and raising all those questions. And you're going to be followed by Senator Kelly, and I think if no one else pops up, Senator Ricketts, you'll be next, or after Senator Kelly. Senator Kelly, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start my questions, I just wanted to give a warm welcome to the brand new director of the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality, Karen Peters. And thank you, all of you, for being here. Director Peters previously served as the Deputy City Manager for the City of Phoenix and has worked on environmental and water policy issues in Arizona for more than 30 years. I'm grateful for her willingness to serve in this new role and look forward to working with her in the months and years to come. And I'm especially grateful that she's joining us today. So, the Good Neighbor Rule is important to Arizona. As I've discussed in this committee before, many parts of Arizona are designated as non-attainment areas for ozone pollution. One of those areas is Yuma County, which borders California to the west and Mexico to the south. And because the area exceeds EPA's air quality standards for ozone, there are limits imposed on the region's economic growth. But Director Peters, how much of Yuma's ozone concentrations are caused by emission sources within Yuma County, as opposed to emission sources from Mexico and California?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Kelly, for the welcome. I want to reiterate that Yuma non-attainment area for ozone is in a very unique situation. The statewide emissions, not just in Yuma County, but statewide emissions of VOC and NOx account for only 10% of the ozone concentrations in Yuma. And so what does Yuma itself contribute to this problem? It is negligible. And NOx and VOC emissions in Yuma are virtually none. So as I have said previously to
So to summarize here, 90% comes from Mexico and California, 10% comes from somewhere within Arizona, but basically nothing comes from Yuma County.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. I don't think I could accurately state that 90% comes from California and Mexico. There are a lot of other natural background and other international sources that contribute to the problem, but certainly it's very significant from California.
But the majority comes from outside the state.
Absolutely. The majority comes from out of state. That's correct.
So how will EPA's actions like the Good Neighbor Rule help ensure that Yuma isn't held accountable for emissions that they have zero control over?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Kelly, the Good Neighbor Rule is essential for Yuma to stay out of non-attainment. They recently were declared in attainment, which is a happy accident, and we're very pleased that that has occurred. But
what was the accident that caused that to occur?
Just that they were able to maintain attainment for the 3-year period.
Okay, they were under the limits.
They did attain the standard and were designated to be in attainment very recently. But because Yuma has no control over the emissions that come into its area, it's very likely that without the Good Neighbor Rule or other controls on interstate transport of ozone precursors, they will go right back. And those non-attainment restrictions on economic activity will return.
And what do we do about that?
Well, thank you, Senator Kelly. I think that what we do about that, unfortunately, if we are declared to be in non-attainment, we have to look to local emission sources, which are negligible, which will...
Why would we even look? I mean, if we already know that it contributes almost nothing to the problem, and the problem comes from somewhere else, we either have to fix the problem somewhere else, or we have to come up with the rationale to allow them to achieve their economic growth goals.
Thank you. So earlier I did mention that the states are preempted from emission standards on new motor vehicles and on-road engines. And so to the extent that we have additional controls in that area, that could absolutely help Yuma. It would help also if we could, EPA could help with international transport of ozone. So there are things that can be done, but they're not things that are within the state and local jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you. I'm out of time, but my office will follow up some more on this. We want to get to a point where Yuma can achieve, its goals and not be penalized by what's happening outside of its control. And then, Mr. Chairman, I want to submit another similar question about Maricopa County for the record.
Yeah, without objection.
Thank you.
Yeah, Senator Kelly, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for inviting Ms. Peters to join us as well.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask a question of Senator Kelly and his witness while they're here? If you're able to determine, or whether EPA...
Let me just ask, Senator Kelly, can you stay?
Yes.
Okay.
If either of you or the EPA is able to help us understand whether some of that pollution is coming from China, which is building, coal-fired power plants without the same environmental controls that the U.S. has, and they're building them like crazy. I think that would be very helpful information to the committee.
Senator Lummis, I'm sure some of it is. I mean, I've, flown around this planet, from an altitude of, above 200 miles, 853 times. And it's remarkable what you can see from Earth orbit. I mean, you can see sand from the Sahara, being blown across the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, you could actually visibly, you could see it. You could see pollution from China winding up in other countries. Very clear. Now, to quantify exactly how much that is, I think that's more complicated. But I imagine the EPA has looked into this. And my guess is it's substantial.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. It's great to have your perspective from space on this. Truly, truly fascinating. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
He was out of this world. One of my favorite songs, One Hit Wonder, Thomas Dolby, She Blinded Me with Science. I see some people nodding in the audience, and we need to be not guided, we're not blinded by science, we need to be guided by science, and hopefully in this regard we will be. Thanks for that exchange you had with Mr. Kelly. Okay, I think I'm going to do a UC, Senator Ricketson, I'll turn right to you. I want to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record of March 2023 fact sheet by the Environmental Protection Agency. It's titled, The Good Neighbor Plan and Reliable Electricity. This fact sheet describes how in crafting the final good neighbor rule, the EPA made several adjustments in the proposed emission reduction requirements for power plants. These changes reflect input received from grid operators across the country and other stakeholders to ensure that the power sector can continue to deliver reliable electricity while also achieving cleaner and reliable and cleaner and healthier era. I ask unanimous consent and without objections. So ordered. And Senator Ricketts, you're on.
Great.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chairman Carper. I appreciate it. And I want to thank our witnesses for joining us here today. And certainly Director Wells, again, my condolences on the tornadoes in Mississippi. Nebraska suffers those as well. And so we can understand how devastating those can be. So know that Mississippi's in our thoughts and prayers. And one of the things that I hear today is how we're implementing the Clean Air Act. I don't think anybody's arguing the Clean Air Act is something that we ought to do away with, that we all want to have clean air. In fact, Nebraska's, according to U.S. News and World Report, has the 6th best natural environment. And we're not actually subject to the Good Neighbor rule right now. But I am concerned about when the EPA is implementing these rules, how it's being done, not only because we have there's ramifications for how they do these things, but also I think it just undermines people's faith in government, that if the EPA isn't doing a good job and doesn't seem to be reasonable and is not following good processes, I think Senator Carter mentioned, that it just kind of undermines everybody's belief that the government can actually work in the rule of law, and I think that's harmful to our republic in general. To that end, actually, one of the things I'd like to do is ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter I sent along with 6 other governors to the Southwest Power Pool regarding our concerns about the premature closures of gas and coal-fired generation. And it's kind of along the lines of what Senator Lummis was talking about.
I object. We never object to this stuff. Go ahead. We don't object. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, because it says in my script here you're supposed to say without objection.
Well, I was close. I think you got the point.
Thank you very much. And so I am concerned about some of the consequences here that would happen if we do have a bad rule, especially if the EPA is not approving any state implementation plans. It seems to suggest that there's something broken in the system. Anyway, Mr. Wells, I'd like to start with you. With electricity rates likely to rise from this rulemaking, what's your level of concern for consumers that struggle to keep up with increasing prices? I mean, over the last 2 years, energy prices alone are up 37%. I know you're not an energy regular pursuer of your environmental quality, but what's your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I've had the pleasure of experiencing that natural beauty of your state, and I hope to get back soon.
Are you a turkey hunter by chance?
Absolutely. My favorite thing to do. So
You got a great barber and you're a turkey hunter.
how did you guess? I would say that I'm very concerned. I think that the cost of everything keeps hitting us all, the increasing cost of everything. And anytime you inject additional uncertainty the way this rule would do, that exacerbates that problem.
So this rule is intended to speed the transition away from fossil electricity production. What level of concern do you have with regard to grid reliability?
Repeat the last part?
The grid reliability.
Oh, very much. I mean, as we discussed with Senator Lummis, I think that anytime you inject uncertainty into that power generation industry with the regulatory burden that industry already suffers, and couple that with the fact that technology on other fronts or other methods of generating electricity is still evolving, it's sort of shooting ourselves in the foot by jeopardizing the current method of generating power.
And your understanding is that the EPA's purview under the Clean Air Act to make rules that control the means of electricity production in the U.S. and force generation shifting?
I am an environmental regulator, and so is EPA, and we should stay in our lane.
Yeah, and I'll just maybe, since I'm running out of time here, I just want to kind of emphasize that as well. We've got obviously the folks in environmental quality from a number of states here, and as a former governor yourself, you know that we hire people to make sure they're doing a good job of protecting our environment. And one of the things I just want to emphasize as we wrap up here is that it's incredibly important that we have a collaborative relationship with the EPA and the states, that we want to protect, nobody wants to protect our environment more than anybody in the state wants to protect it. Certainly, when I was governor of Nebraska, we wanted to make sure we had a clean environment for our fellow Nebraskans. Nobody cared more about it than other Nebraskans. And that's why it's really important that we have a good relationship with the EPA as to how to actually attain these goals and make sure we have good modeling, good process so people believe in it. And with that, my time has expired. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thanks. From one recovering governor to another, I'm delighted that you're on this committee, and thanks for being a part of this hearing. I think Senator Bozeman is next.
Thank you,
colleague
Mr.
that we have a real focus on recycling in this committee. Nobody does more on that than Senator Bozeman. Senator Bozeman, you're recognized.
Nobody more than you and I, but nobody more than you and I staff does a tremendous job. So thank you all for being with us. Mr. Wells, on February 13th, 2023, the EPA announced its disapproval of the Arkansas State Implementation Plan for the 2015 rule regarding ozone national ambient air quality standards. Instead, Arkansas is now required to follow the federal implementation plan, which will put roughly 50 Arkansas businesses at risk of closure. I understand, again, after listening to your testimony, you're in the same situation. The impacted businesses include power plants, natural gas pipelines, cement producers, steel factories, glass and paper, chemical manufacturers, paper mills, etc. The EPA has refused to let Arkansas revise the plan. The Clean Air Act was intended to prescribe a cooperative federalism model of regulation between the states and the federal government. Do you feel EPA treated your state fairly in this way, the way it handled and ultimately rejected your SIP plan?
No, sir, I don't. I believe they moved the goalpost on us after we submitted our SIP. We believe it was approvable at the time we submitted it, and for them to reject the SIP based on information that was not available to us at the time we developed it, and not give us an opportunity to revise it and to have say-so in terms of the emission reductions that would be placed on Mississippi facilities, I think was a circumvention of the Clean Air Act.
So, Director Peters, you don't know if yours is going to be approved or not. Do you feel like it's appropriate, if it's not approved, that you're put in the same situation as Arkansas, Mississippi, and I'm sure other states, in the sense of not being able to revise your plan? Instead, the federal government, sitting here in Washington, implements a plan for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Boozman. Of course, we're awaiting EPA's decision, and we'll evaluate very closely what it is that they decide and how it impacts our state. Until we see that, it's really difficult for me to speak to it. Of course, I'm concerned for the potential impacts to businesses and sources in our state, but we recognize our shared responsibility for clean air.
No, I understand. I think we all want to get to the same point. As the chairman indicated, he's going to ask you a question about where the middle ground is, but certainly the idea that you, being on the ground, your state, you guys want clean air as much as anybody. The idea that the EPA is great until you disagree with them, okay? They talk about, federal cooperation and all of this stuff. But again, once you disagree, then it tends to be their way. So the point I'm trying to make is, as we go forward for this to work, for it to be fair nationwide, then again, the states need to have the ability to be a part of that. And that hasn't been the case in Mississippi and Arkansas. And I assume that both of you all, as administrators, would agree, that's not appropriate. Mr. Noe, in your testimony, you said that the Good Neighbor Plan is just one piece of a massive regulatory agenda that concerns you. Can you provide further details of regulations that are going to impact pulp and paper mills?
Yes, thank you for the question, Senator.
And tell us about the communities that the pulp and paper mills are in.
Yes, yes, sir.
Rural America, what
Yes.
that would do to these
Yes,
small
and first I
towns.
just want to thank you for giving voice to our industry and the over 23,000 workers we have in Arkansas and 84 facilities. There are a whole series of regulations that are coming at us, and they're coming very soon. One example is EPA's PM-NACS rule. We're not questioning EPA's whether they ought to regulate here, but the problem is they're moving so fast, which is also why they made the mistakes they made in this rule, that they're not going to have an implementation plan ready for when it kicks in. We're in kind of a catch-22 under the Clean Air Act, where because we're in these remote rural communities where the air's clean, we're in attainment. Ironically, the requirements kick in immediately. It's the dirtier areas that are non-attainment that get extensions, that can trade with other sources, do offsets and all of that. What does this mean? It means there's going to be a permit gridlock problem. We're not going to be able to get the permits we need to modernize our mills, which, by the way, makes them both cleaner and competitive. There's a bunch of other rules I noted in my statement, and there are a whole lot more, Senator. I've never seen a regulatory agenda this massive in my career, and I've worked on these issues for many years.
Dr. Hill, you mentioned, the impact this has on your patients. What are, just out of curiosity, what are the top 4 or 5, when you see patients, what are the top 4 or 5? You mentioned this is a causal factor of them having problems. What are the top 4 or 5 causal factors of the patients you see besides this?
So, when we're looking at asthma, frequently allergies and allergens play a role, and
So
air
cat
pollution
dander.
has a cumulative effect on allergens. So both ozone and particulate matter tends to make allergens more harmful to the lungs.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an additive effect between
So allergens,
pollution
what
control.
else?
Cigarette smoking and other forms of smoking in this country is still a significant cause of lung disease. Infectious disease, obviously, triggering exacerbations in this population. Those are the real big factors, but air pollution plays a significant role. And in my own practice, in our electronic health record, we actually, for our asthma and COPD patients, have specific checkboxes because patients will tell us they can't go outside on hot, humid days. They have trouble breathing. They can't exercise.
If you drive up the cost of everything dramatically, where does poverty play? What role does it play in that?
It's a challenge. I don't think this is the right venue to talk about the cost of healthcare in general.
Well, I'm talking about the cost of electricity and everything else.
It plays a role. Being unable to breathe, as the Lung Association says, is the one thing that really matters. The EPA's estimates say that this will increase the cost of electricity by about 1%. That's probably not our biggest concern in rising electricity costs. So I think any increase in cost to my patients, particularly those who are economically challenged, is a concern. But the downstream health effects of this make it a worthwhile investment. Okay. I have this conversation with my patients all the time in terms of cost of care. Taking their preventative medicines is expensive. Getting sick and going to the hospital is much more expensive. So sometimes you have to spend the money up front to save the money down the road.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Senator Bozeman, thanks as always for joining us today and for your questions. I've got a question for a couple of questions here. And for the entire panel, a question dealing with the importance of heavy-duty NOx rule. And many of you mentioned in your testimony the need for EPA to also act on transportation emissions to help states meet the ozone standards. Transportation sources are not covered under the Good Neighbor Rule, but do remain one of the largest contributors to smog and climate pollutions in this country of ours. Often, just like upwind pollution blowing across state lines, transportation pollution is very difficult for states to reduce on their own. In December, EPA finalized a rule reducing nitrogen oxide emissions from heavy-duty vehicles by 48% by 2045. That's by 48% by 2045. EPA is also poised to propose additional vehicle emission standards in the coming months. Here's my question. Briefly, do you support EPA's actions to reduce heavy-duty vehicle nitrogen oxide emissions? And if you answer, and in your answer, if you would, please let us know if you support further EPA actions to address vehicle emissions to help reduce smog, soot, and climate pollution. And Dr. Hill, I'm going to ask you to lead off, and then Secretary McElwain. We'll come right down the line.
So briefly, speaking as chair of the Public Policy Committee for the Lung Association, we strongly support EPA's heavy-duty vehicle rule. It's estimated to prevent nearly 3,000 deaths a year by 2045. We also strongly support stronger rules controlling vehicle emissions, including a transition to zero-emission vehicles in order to prevent premature death.
All right, thank you. Secretary McElwain.
We absolutely strongly support EPA's action to reduce NOx emissions from vehicles. And just in general, we continue to need and rely on strong federal vehicle standards. And that's the only way we're going to ensure that we have clean air. And it's especially important when we think about overburdened communities that have been impacted by pollution from heavy-duty diesel trucks. So yes, full support.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Director Peters.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. We support the rule. As I alluded earlier, in the Phoenix Mesa non-attainment area, 90% of the emissions are from 90% of NOx emissions are vehicle-based. So reductions in heavy duty will absolutely assist. Not soon enough for us to avoid potential downgrade, but will absolutely assist, and I applaud EPA stepping up on that.
Mr. Wells, please.
Mr. Chairman, I'll answer the question by saying that I think that there is no single cause for any non-attainment issues that a particular area may have, and I think that that part of what we would ask is that instead of imposing the FIP that has been imposed here without giving us adequate opportunity to, us and EPA, to fully evaluate all of the different factors that may be coming into play, that's what we would ask for, is that we take the time to really determine what is causing the non-attainment in a particular area, and whether or not contributions from outside the state are of that particular state are causing or contributing to that non-attainment. Whether those factors include mobile sources, I think that is certainly a factor that needs to be looked at, just in terms of what a local area that isn't potentially in non-attainment can do to help themselves, but also in terms of how the modeling that underpins this rule is evaluated and applied.
All right, thank you. Mr. Noe, same question.
Mr. Chairman, as I said at the beginning, we support sustainable regulation, and I'm not an expert on mobile sources, but as I indicated in my statement, my understanding is that there are cost-effective reductions available there.
Okay, thank you. Second question, we've been joined by Senator Whitehouse. I'm going to ask these two questions and then yield to him. Secretary McElwain, and this would be for you, and I think for Director Peters as well. Sharing high quality and transparent, reliable information is vital in fulfilling EPA's missions to protect human health and our environment, especially as the agency works with states to develop rulemakings. EPA has told my staff, maybe other staffs here, that the agency provided modeling information in the public docket and has provided themselves to meet with all state agencies who may have questions. My question, I guess, would be Secretary McElwain and Director Peters. Do you believe that the Environmental Protection Agency has been transparent and proactive in sharing information and data regarding updated modeling results for the proposed federal implementation plan and final Good Neighbor Plan? Secretary McElwain.
Yes, I do believe that. Want me to expand?
Just a little bit. A little bit, please.
Yeah, we've worked with US EPA. They've been very open. Several states and we came together, well, before me, but my state was involved. And we had a couple of, some feedback in terms of creating the rule. And one of the feedback that we gave was we wanted them to include municipal waste combustion in the rule, and they did. And so that's just an example of the collaboration that we've had with US EPA.
Yeah, that's a good example. Same question, Director Peters.
Thank you. And I would agree that we have a very good working relationship with EPA. As was discussed earlier, our SIP is still being evaluated, and we're looking forward to a final decision. But our relationship is very strong, and we are very satisfied with the communication we've had. So yes, the answer is yes.
All right. A follow-up question for you, Director Wells. Did EPA ever meet, to your knowledge, with the Mississippi Department of Environmental Quality to discuss EPA's modeling and the basis for the state's linkage to downwind receptors?
Well, Senator, Mr. Chairman, I would say that we did have meetings with them. I think they were transparent in terms of providing the results of their modeling and telling us that we were impacting Texas air quality. What I don't think a way that I do not think they were cooperative as they should have been was giving us an opportunity, adequate time to evaluate. Let me say this. We do not have on staff at Little Old Mississippi DEQ the expertise that it takes to dig into this modeling in the period of time that we were given. And so while we were provided the results and told what our impacts were based on those results, that modeling results, we were not given adequate opportunity to evaluate that, contradict it, or dispute it, maybe is the better word to use, or to counter it in any way. And while EPA would probably say the data was available to us, the amount of time that we had to do so was inadequate.
All right. I'm going to give, will you do questions for the record? I'm probably send you a question for the record just to allow you to amplify on that response if you would. Let's see. I'm going to come back. I'm going to take a quick break. Senator Whitehouse has joined us. He's going to hold the gavel, and I'll be right back. We started voting, I think, on the floor, so we've got a lot going on here. But don't go away. And I'll come back and we'll ask the consensus question, and that I telegraphed early on. Sheldon, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks for this hearing. As a fellow small, downwind, coastal state, we have a lot in common, and we have a particular lot in common.
For the record, just know we punch above our weight.
We do punch way above our weight, exactly. Small but mighty. I wanted to explore a little bit some of the recent evidence we've had out of Rhode Island with respect to ozone. Dr. Hill, I'll ask you. The ozone levels in Rhode Island in Providence County have earned us an F. In Kent County, which is more rural, a D. In Washington County, also more rural, a D. What kind of news is an F and two Ds for Rhode Island lungs?
Well, those are not the report cards I'd want to bring home to my parents. You know, it's not good news for your constituents, particularly children, the elderly, those with chronic lung disease. What those non-attainment levels mean is that on bad air quality days, people with chronic lung disease are going to suffer. Young children are going to be put at higher risk. So children spend more time outside exercising. I was a high school athlete, and the world is a hotter place, within many places worse ozone levels sometimes, due to the changing climate than it was 30 years ago, or maybe more, when I was a high school athlete. So those non-attainment grades, those Fs and Ds, mean we're failing the public. And they're breathing unhealthy air. And as was said earlier here, air is not partisan. Respects no boundaries. We all breathe it in this room, and we all breathe it out in the world.
I can recall, to your point, driving into work and on drive time radio, hearing the local announcement that today was a bad air day in Rhode Island. Perfectly beautiful day as you drive along. Ozone is not visible. Perfectly beautiful day. And the warnings were exactly as you said. If you have an infant, if you have a child with asthma, if you have a breathing difficulty, or if you're elderly, you should stay inside today. On a beautiful day, the kind of days that have a kid scratching at the door to get out and run around. But nope, supposed to stay inside if you have any breathing difficulties because of the ozone. And to your point about boundaries, a great deal of this ozone does not originate in Rhode Island. The chemicals that sunlight turns into ozone come from elsewhere. And one of the things that I find very tiresome is how the state of Rhode Island has difficulty defending itself against out-of-state pollution. This is where I think the good neighbor rule comes into play, because Rhode Island's Department of Environmental Management cannot regulate a smokestack in Ohio or Pennsylvania or West Virginia. We're stuck with it. And for a while, the solution in those places was higher smokestacks. Jet the stuff higher up so it lands on Rhode Island instead of us. There were times when I wish that the rule was no smokestacks. Then you have to own your mess, and you can't just export it to other states, letting the wind do your dirty work. Director Peters, is that frustration an experience of yours, and do we depend on EPA to provide those remedies when states simply can't?
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. I discussed earlier the very limited jurisdiction and ability to regulate that states and local jurisdictions have under the Clean Air Act. And that is a source of some frustration when so much of the emissions that result in ozone pollution come from elsewhere, come from background levels, come from mobile sources that we do not regulate. So yes, absolutely, there's so little that we can do at the state and local level to affect that on behalf of our residents. It can be frustrating.
And Dr. Hill, say a closing word about the health and healthcare costs of Fs and Ds, and what that means, not just for ruining a kid's day, but for local budgets and healthcare costs.
Yep, those healthcare costs are in the tens of billions of dollars. That's why this Good Neighbor Plan is so cost-effective, because preventing those downwind effects are going to pay healthcare dividends down the road.
So a good neighbor rule will pay huge dividends. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thanks so much for joining us, Senator Whitehouse, and thanks for your great work on these issues. I want to just go back to. I've quoted Thomas Dolby. I quoted my mom. I quoted my dad, and I won't repeat Dolby again, but about being blinded by science. But I want to mention again the words of my mother, who raised my sister and me from the age of like little kids. We should. Abide by the golden rule, treat other people the way we want to be treated. And for me, it's my default. If I'm trying to figure out what's the right thing to do, I try to put myself in other people's shoes and say how would I want to be treated. It turns out that's in every major religion of the world. I don't care if you're Protestant, Catholic, Buddhist, Jew, Hindu. The golden rule is in everybody's. So one thing we all agree on. That's pretty. And when that happens, I say maybe we should follow it. So we're going to try to keep that in mind as we go forward. I mentioned a couple things. My dad, I should ask all of you to share with us some of the things your parents said to you over and over again. But one of the things my dad always said to my sister and me over and over again, we do some boneheaded stunt, and he would always say, just use some common sense. He didn't say it so nicely, but he said it a lot. We must not have had any common sense. But I hope we have some now, and we need to certainly put it to work. Another thing my dad said a whole lot of was, he said, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing well. If a job's worth doing, it's worth doing well. And for me, that means if it isn't perfect, make it better. And everything I do, I know I can do better. The close here is. My closing questions is just take some time in days to come. We'll send you a request for sort of a formal request for follow-up. I got it. But I'm really interested in an area or two where you think there's consensus. That would be great, and that will help us. I've talked to our majority staff or minority staff, and I said, if we can't figure this out, we need to find a new job. And that does not suggest this is easy, it ain't. But some of the most important things are some of the hardest things to do. And we need to get this right. And we're given the blessing to have these responsibilities to sit in these chairs and help make decisions for our country. And we want to be proactive, and we want to be constructive, and we need your input on that. But in closing, I want to thank you all. For your time, for your testimony today. Thank you for what you do in your own states. I hope your work gives you great joy. I love helping people, and my guess is that you do too. And one of the best ways we can help them is make sure all over the country, all 50 states, we have air that we can safely breathe, and make sure our kids are well, our grandchildren are well, and people are able to go to work and not be sick. And try to hold down, rein in our healthcare costs, and so I think if we do get this right, we can do literally all of those things. But the Good Neighbor Rule is about making sure that all states do their part to clean up the air we breathe, as you know. And we heard today that the new rule is long overdue. We also heard how more often than not, downwind states unfairly bear the burden of air pollution from their upwind neighbors. Without the help of the EPA, there's not much that downwind states can do to relieve the economic and health burden of cross-state air pollution. I know that's especially true in my own home state, where more than 90%, as I said earlier, more than 90% of the air pollution in our state comes from outside of our state. We also heard some good news today. We heard that the good neighbor rule is achievable. In many circumstances, upwind polluters will just have to consistently operate the technology they've already installed. For me, it seems like a small price to pay to protect those of us who are downwind. And before we object, I'm going to ask unanimous consent to submit into the record a variety of materials related to today's hearing. This includes public comments on the then proposed Good Neighbor rule from the Ozone Transport Commission, a multi-state organization made up of 12 mid-Atlantic and Northeast states, and also includes D.C. The Ozone Transport Commission expressed overall support for the rule, support for the inclusion of industrial sources, and provided data on similar actions already being taken by member states. I hear no objection to that. I'm going to move on to a little bit of housekeeping. Senators will be allowed to submit written questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday, April 12th. That's when my colleagues have to submit their questions. Wednesday, April 12th, close of business, and we'll compile those questions and send them on to each of you, and ask you, if you will, to respond to us by the next morning. All right, how about Wednesday, April 26th? April 26th, how's that? Again, this has been encouraging. I'm a half glass, half full guy, and I found this encouraging. And we appreciate you coming from all over the country, different perspectives, different backgrounds, but you want to find good solutions that are fair and equitable. I think we can do that. And what did Henry Ford used to say? If you think you can, or you think you can't, you're right. In this case, I think we can, and I think we must. So with that, this hearing is, with my left hand, adjourned. Thank you all.